What's happening, everybody? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports podcast. This is, once again, the UFC 262 post-fight recap. Very, very pumped up to be on the show, recapping all the action from last night's major UFC event, UFC 262. This was a fun one. This was an event that I think we saw a lot of not just exciting action, but action that we least expected. Action that in ways in which we least expected, I guess you could say. When I thought of how these fights would go down, winner, loser, who would win, who would lose, how they won or how they lost, did not come to fruition whatsoever. The exact opposite scenarios came into play here for UFC 262, and this is the UFC 262 post-fight recap. I had some issues when I first went live, so sorry if there was a little bit of a delay on the live stream. StreamYard, where I'm streaming this, shout out to them. They do a great job, but I've had some issues lately with the stream, so hopefully, those issues are eradicated on their end soon. So let's get to the point here. Let's get into each and every fight within UFC 262. And I want to profile three fights in particular. The main event last night, which was for the vacant UFC lightweight strap, you had Charles Oliveira, Michael Chandler. Charles Oliveira, a gritty veteran of the UFC octagon. Michael Chandler coming off of a prolific UFC debut over Dan Hooker, winning that fight in knockout fashion on a grand stage co-main event. McGregor-Poirier card. Mike Chandler puts the lights out of Dan Hooker and gets granted a UFC World Lightweight title shot in a UFC fight. So when I look at this bout, there were a lot of people somewhat pissing and moaning that Michael Chandler got a UFC lightweight title shot. They felt like he didn't deserve the title shot. They felt like Michael Chandler was gifted this title shot. Timing is everything. Dana White said it best. Timing is everything. Michael Chandler had the opportunity of a lifetime last night. He came up short, but the story in the Oliveira versus Chandler recap is the fight itself and how the fight actually played itself out. That first round was a hellacious first round from Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler. Position changes left and right. Momentum changes left and right. 1 minute you'd think that Charles Oliveira was going to win the fight. The next minute you'd think that Michael Chandler was going to win the fight. Chandler was in a really bad, precarious position early in the first round. He was able to weather the storm of that bad position, and it's a position that Oliveira finishes fights in. He's known to finish those fights in that position over the course of his career, and the fact that Michael Chandler got out of that somewhat rear naked choke type situation with Charles Oliveira as they were transitioning and trying to work their way, out of it, as Chandler tried to work his way out of it. Oliveira was transitioning, trying to find whether it was an armbar or an ankle lock or any sort of submission that he could to keep Chandler down, to keep him down on the mat to his level, and he was unable to do so. That, to me, showed, okay, Michael Chandler belongs here. He was given the task of Charles Oliveira, knowing that Charles Oliveira is one of the most dynamic submission artists in the game today, and Chandler was able to weather that storm, was able to, stay on it, get back to his feet, and stay in the fight, essentially. So that's where I want to start off with. That first round was amazing. Chandler had his moments in the fight in that first round where it looked like Chandler was going to win and drop Charles Passion to the tune of Dan Hooker. That didn't happen. Second round, we come out, and in the first sequence in the first round, I want to go back to the first round here. In the first sequence of the first round, Chandler threw that, short looping left hand that he likes to throw lately in his last few fights. He landed it on Benson Henderson. He landed it on Dan Hooker, as I mentioned. He landed it on Charles Oliveira. It wasn't enough to put Charles Oliveira away, but it was certainly enough to kind of get Charles Oliveira's attention for Oliveira to say, whoa, what's that? That hit me. That hurt. That stung me. And I think Chandler going into that second round, he thought, well, let's try to initiate the second round with the same combination or a setup to that combination, and Oliveira, won't be prepared for it, and I'll be able to land that combination. And fortunately for Oliveira, he was ready for it. He was ready for the short shoulder dip into a left hook that Chandler loves to throw, the right shoulder dip, left hook kind of fake. And Oliveira was right there for it, ready, willing, and able to time it, to counter it, and to avoid it. And when he avoided it, he threw a left hand of his own, and that left hand found the chin of Michael Chandler. And when you're in that point where you're rocked, you're hurt, the only thing Michael Chandler was trying to do at that point was to create a little bit of distance, to get away from Charles Oliveira, get the cobwebs out, and get back to fighting, get back on the level playing field. But within that octagon, guys get lost along that crease inside the octagon, that bend inside the octagon. Chandler got lost in that wingspan, and was unable to avoid another thunderous punch from Charles Oliveira that sent Michael Chandler down to the canvas, and that was all she wrote. The fight could have been stopped a lot sooner than it was. Chandler took some unnecessary shots, I thought. Could have been stopped a lot sooner, but hey, the ref wasn't in the position to stop it. So with that being said, recapping the main event, Oliveira wins gold, the second round TKO over Michael Chandler. And I'll get to the other fights in a little bit, but I really wanted to start off with the main event, and typically I don't. But I think the big question now is not only that Charles Oliveira fulfills his true potential with this fight in a title-winning bout, nonetheless, picture-perfect way to fulfill your potential in a title-winning bout, but who is next? Who is next for Charles Oliveira? You have the UFC Shark Tank of 155 pounds. You know that you got Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier going at it in July. You got Justin Gaethje waiting in the wings. You have options, and a fighter that has options is a successful fighter. That is where you want to be if you're a fighter with options. That's how you want to play it. That's how you want to bring it to the table in terms of your next performance. Who is next for me? Why are they next for me? How are they next for me? And that's the big question. How will the next title contender rise? That's the big question within that UFC lightweight division. Who will it be, but how will it be? Because I think in terms of impressiveness, that is what grants you a title shot, not necessarily your ranking. Rankings don't mean jack squat, okay? Case in point, Tony Ferguson won 12 straight fights in the UFC lightweight division, taking on the who's who, beating the who's who. He didn't get a title shot. Michael Chandler takes one fight on in the UFC, gets a knockout, an impressive first-round knockout over Dan Hooker, nonetheless, the durable Dan Hooker, and Dana White grants him a UFC title shot. So rankings don't mean jack squat. In this case, who is next is what matters, right? That's what we always talk about in mixed martial arts. Who is next, but how and why are they next? Charles Oliveira has a golden opportunity here to strike while the iron's hot. In terms of his own, marketing, the UFC is hot. The UFC is selling. The UFC is doing really well right now. Charles Oliveira is at the precipice of that in the sport's biggest and best division. Charles Oliveira holds the ranking as the best champ, as the champ in the best division. So good on him, right? But now the opportunity is there in Charles Oliveira's next fight to take on a fighter that has that name worthiness. If Dustin Poirier beats Conor McGregor, he's one of the biggest names in the sport. I'm saying if he beats him again, of course, he beat him once before, but if he beats him twice, that's huge. That's really huge. If we are looking at Oliveira and McGregor, that's obviously huge for Oliveira. McGregor's the biggest fight in the sport. So you're rooting for either one. Either scenario is not necessarily a bad scenario. So Charles Oliveira can kind of, sit back, let the, division play itself out and say to himself, I can just sit, I can just wait, I can see what's next for me. I don't have to really call anyone out, but I'll show up in July in Las Vegas to watch Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor go at it. And I think that those are the next two guys. One of those two guys will probably get the next UFC title shot. For me, I think that's what makes sense for Charles Oliveira. Now, the next question is, who is next for Michael Chandler? At any rate, losing this fight for Michael Chandler really sucked. I have to say, he looked devastated. He looked a little bit demoralized. He looked a little bit befuddled in how he came up short. How did he come up short? Why did he come up short? He came up short when he zigged and he should have zagged. That's it. That's all it was. Just this much. It was a margin of error that was so small, and unfortunately, Michael Chandler achieved that margin of error in this case en route to a loss. But at any rate, Michael Chandler did come up short, but he won some fans. I don't think anyone can come away from that fight saying that Michael Chandler didn't deserve it. He showed that he belonged in there with the man that is now the UFC lightweight champion in Charles Oliveira. And nonetheless, Charles Oliveira, to make a point on how great Charles Oliveira has been in recent fights, Oliveira's got a win over Tony Ferguson, Kevin Lee, and Michael Chandler in his last three fights. Those three guys are three tough, athletic fighters, especially in the case of Kevin Lee and especially in the case of Michael Chandler. And they're all different guys. They're all different fighters, what they bring to the table, their strengths, their weaknesses. And Oliveira beat them at their own game each and every time in those three fights. So 3 straight wins for Charles Oliveira, and those 3 wins are hot wins. Michael Chandler is coming off of a loss now, back to the title contention ranks. And I think that there's a fight out there for him that makes a ton of sense. A fight out there that I think would appease each and every mixed martial arts fan out there, and that is a fight between Michael Chandler and Justin Gaethje. That's the fight that I want to see for Michael Chandler in his next bout. I think that's the fight that makes a ton of sense. Entertainment-wise, that's the fight that needs to be made for the UFC lightweight division. You look at it this way. Michael Chandler is coming off of a UFC title loss. Justin Gaethje is coming off of a UFC title loss. So, I think that that's the fight that makes sense for both guys. Whether it happens, whether it doesn't, remains to be seen. But that's the fight that I want to see. That's the fight. So that's my main event discussion on UFC 262. I usually end the show with the main event, but I wanted to start the show with the main event in this case because it was such a fun fight. I was so excited to talk about it. The back and forth between Oliveira and Chandler, it looked as if, Chandler was going to get him. Looked as if, we were going to see, somebody really show something, whether it was in the first round or not. Ultimately, it was in the second round. I really want everyone's thoughts on who they think, Oliveira should fight next, or who, it should come down to for the fight. McGregor beats Poirier, McGregor's getting another title shot. I hate to break it to you guys, but if Poirier beats McGregor, he's probably getting a title shot. So I think that that's who it's going to come down to. But if you guys disagree, let me know. I'd love to hear other people's opinions. Chandler, I think Chandler and Gaethje is just the fight for Chandler. I think that's the fight that makes the most sense. And we'll see what happens there. We'll see if that's the route that the UFC decides to go in. But let's talk about this co-main event. Versus Dariush recap. Tony Ferguson versus Beneil Dariush in the co-main event. UFC 155-pound fight. Lightweight fight. Tony Ferguson, man, this is tough for me. This is really tough because on this show, I've made a point that I don't want to call, someone's career. I don't want to say, oh, this guy's done. This guy's, not what he once was. I don't want to be disrespectful in that regard. I would rather, not go down that road, if you know what I mean. But I don't know how you can come away watching Tony Ferguson and Beneil Dariush without the following. And it's the Ryan Thomas takeaway of UFC 262. And that takeaway is that Tony Ferguson's prime came and went. It was here and it was gone in the blink of an eye. And I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this in quite some time. And it's something that, great fighters experience, but it's seldom at this highest of highs and lowest of lows rate. I think I've only seen it in recent cases with a guy by the name of Tyron Woodley, who was the former UFC welterweight champion, of course. He's coming off of, 4 straight losses. He's not even in the UFC anymore. At one point, the two most devastating strikers, the two most devastating fighters, respectively, in the UFC welterweight and the UFC lightweight division were Tyron Woodley and Tony Ferguson. And now Tony Ferguson is on a 3-fight skid, losing to Gaethje, losing to Oliveira, and losing to Beneil Dariush. Gaethje won the interim title off that fight. Oliveira went on to win the UFC lightweight title last night, in his next fight. Beneil Dariush, does that mean he's a top contender? Of course it does. He's now a top 5 fighter in this division of the UFC lightweight division. What does it mean for Tony? Who is his next fight? Who should Tony be matched up with? Who should Tony fight? I mean, that's a realistic question that I think Dana White is going to have to answer at some rate, at some point. Too soon to ask Dana at the post-fight press conference whether or not Tony is done with the UFC, or too soon to ask Dana who Tony should fight next. What do you do with Tony Ferguson after this fight? This was a fight that Tony was never in it. There was never a moment of time in last night's bout between Tony Ferguson and Beneil Dariush where Tony Ferguson had a shot to win. There was 0 moments that Tony created in that fight. And I say that somewhat harshly because it's not harshly towards Tony Ferguson. It's harshly towards the coaching, the training. Something is missing there. Something is missing there with Tony Ferguson and his last few fights. He's just not the same guy. I think physically he's not the same guy. And I don't know if mentally he's the same guy as well. And that's a question that I think only Tony Ferguson knows the answer to that question. Only Tony knows how he feels mentally, how he feels physically. Does he not feel as well as he did, in previous fights? If that's the case, he's only going to do more damage to his body in future fights if he continues to fight. But it's amazing to me, it's startling to me that Tony's prime came and went. I mean, this was a guy that was looked at as the greatest threat to Khabib Nurmagomedov. Respectfully, I'm saying this respectively, with all due respect, if we judge Tony Ferguson's last couple performances, Khabib goes through him like a hot knife through butter. That fight doesn't even last maybe 2 rounds. Say that with all due respect. With all due respect. So, in this, I feel like I'm taking away from Beneil Dariush a little bit here, but Tony didn't offer resistance. There was take. He was just taking the whole fight. There was no giving. It was all taking. He was taking what Beneil Dariush gave him. He wasn't giving anything to that fight. And that's unfortunate because I like Tony. I've been a Tony fan for a long time, but I think the end has come. The time has come. I think his prime is past. He's 37 years old. Nobody wants to see Tony Ferguson take unnecessary punishment. I'd rather see Tony Ferguson represent the sport by being in a commentating booth, whether it's at a desk, ESPN, like it was at Fox Sports 1. I think that would make a lot of sense. He's a wacky, zany guy that people really like, and he's somebody that I think would do well in that role. I think if you're not fighting for title contention, what's the point? What's the point? Before we had somewhat the built-in reasoning of no fans being there, and maybe, Tony's wind wasn't in his sails anymore due to that. Fighting twice in 2020 with no fans. We had a full house last night, and Tony looked less inspired than he did in his last 2 fights. I don't know what that is. Is that something that maybe Tony needs to see a sports psychiatrist for? I don't know. But these last 3 fights, Tony has just looked uninspired. So 1 strike on average, 30 strikes for 30 minutes. That's what he's averaged his last 3 fights. That's 1 punch a minute. That's not going to cut it in any fight, let alone in the UFC. You could have that output in a street fight, and if the guy's tough enough, it won't go well. So, a little harsh in terms of my criticism of Tony Ferguson. It's not even criticism of Tony Ferguson. It's more so criticism of this training that has allowed him to regress. Is it old age? Is it training? Lack of training? I couldn't tell you. I think it could be a mix of both. Last night, there was a firefight between Edson Barboza and Shane Burgos. Before I get to that, I want to remind everybody what I think should be next for Beneil Dariush. It could possibly be Justin Gaethje as well. Could possibly be Kevin Lee. I mean, there's options out there for Beneil Dariush. But Beneil Dariush is a guy that I think he's a contender, but I don't know how legitimate of a contender he is. And that sounds crazy. It sounds disrespectful, given that, Beneil beat Tony Ferguson last night, but that was not the best Tony Ferguson. It just wasn't. So Barboza and Burgos recap. This was a firefight. This was a back-and-forth clash of titans at 145 pounds in the UFC featherweight division. Edson Barboza cutting down from 155 to 145. A lot of people believed that Edson Barboza was making a grave mistake and moving down to 145 once again. They felt like the weight cut was too tough for him. Was a bad decision by Edson Barboza. I'm here to tell you, folks, after that fight, after Edson Barboza defeated Shane Burgos via TKO, Edson Barboza is a threat at 145 pounds. Moves probably into the top 10 of the division now that with that win over Shane Burgos. But Edson Barboza, that's an exciting fighter on any day, let alone in the UFC featherweight division. That's an exciting fight for anyone in the featherweight division. It's an exciting fight for anyone that is a fan of the featherweight division. Edson Barboza could fight at 170, 155, 145, and people would be excited to watch him fight. He is just that entertaining, and he has been for a long time. I like the fact that he cut the weight. He got down to 145 the right way, and he delivered. Now, in all seriousness, recapping this fight, recapping the action here of Burgos and Barboza, I was severely worried for Shane Burgos based on how that fight ended last night with Barboza and Burgos. I thought Burgos was badly hurt in a way that we've never seen in UFC history. I thought that there was a potential, brain bleed situation. The delayed reaction to that punch to the jaw from Barboza to Burgos, I've never seen anything like it. Burgos takes that shot, that right hand to the jaw. He backs up, and then his eyes just go completely cross-eyed, and he moves back, crashes into the cage, and, follow-up punches. Not only, Barboza wasn't unnecessary for firing those. You're fighting until the ref pulls you off. Where the hell are these refs in these moments? They're completely on the other side of the cage. That's when these guys take the unnecessary punishment that they don't need to take because these refs are completely out of position. That's something that I get so infuriated by that. But it was what it was. It is what it is. Barboza gets the W. Burgos back to the drawing board. But Edson Barboza is a player, a true player at 145 pounds. Make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. This was my UFC 262 post-fight recap. Caitlin Chukagian with a solid win last night. She inches closer to another title shot. I'm very curious to see what's next for her. She's kind of in a precarious position as far as losing a title shot, but just dispatching every contender that they've thrown her way ever since. I'm very curious to see what is next for her. great fights last night. I really enjoyed the fights last night. They were very entertaining. Next month, June 12th, the next pay-per-view, we got Israel Adesanya versus Marvin Vettori. We have in the co-main event, Davison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno. And then the third fight on the card prior to the and main event, Leon Edwards and Nate Diaz. I'm very excited for that fight. The return of Nate Diaz, I think, will be a fun one. I think a lot of people are overlooking Nate, thinking that Leon is going to walk right through him. I don't know if anyone has walked right through Nate Diaz, not to my knowledge. So I'm very excited for that fight. So stay tuned for that post-fight show next month. We got some fight night action too. I'll be sure to give you guys previews and post-fight reactions to those as well. A lot of Buffalo Bills discussion on this podcast, of course, so stay tuned for more post-draft discussion as we lean into OTAs, training camp, shortened preseason from 4 weeks to 3, thank God, and a added week onto the NFL season. I'm very, very excited for the National Football League season, and very excited in particular for the Bills season, of course. So stay tuned for that discussion. A lot of NFL discussion as well across the whole entire football league that is the National Football League, and baseball, hockey, you name it, I'm covering it. So stay tuned for more. Thank you for tuning in. Take care and stay safe.